What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Marketing Desk. I'm your host, Tyler Fleischer. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Jordan Achilli, VP of Brand Design at Forge. Jordan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Tyler, how are you doing? Excited to be on the inaugural episode of the Marketing Desk. This is excited for you and definitely all the luck moving forward with everybody and all the different episodes.
I appreciate it. Let's go. So, to kick things off, let's just do a quick round of introductions for people who don't know you. What are you working on right now at Forge?
Sure, yeah. So I work as VP of Brand at Forge. I've been there for about a year, and it's kind of an interesting situation. I was brought in to basically overhaul the design, the overall brand, kind of push this into version 2.0. And then probably 3 or 4 months after I was there, we were acquired by Charles Schwab. And so now my role has been a bit of like uh, pivoted more towards just the integration process with our platform. Forge is basically like it's a platform that allows you to create a market for any private equity that you have working at a private company and basically integrate our platform and our company within the Charles Schwab ecosystem. And so it's definitely not sort of what I signed up for, but it's an interesting process nonetheless. And it's hopefully will yield a really good synergistic sort of working relationship between Forge and Charles Schwab.
Yeah, I want to kind of get into how you go about merging two brands like that during an acquisition, maybe a little bit later in our conversation. But I do want to mention you do have quite a lot of experience in digital assets in the crypto industry at prior roles and personal interests as well. So I think there's a lot of synergies with your knowledge of the industry. And Forge is actually an interesting, I guess, role for you because it's not specifically crypto and digital assets, but being acquired by Charles Schwab now and just in the financial services ecosystem, I think there's also a lot of synergies there as well. So I wanted to make that mention too of your experience in the crypto industry is pretty vast.
Yeah, yeah. I've always primarily worked like in media and fintech throughout most of my career and worked at the New York Times, then worked at Bloomberg. And then from Bloomberg, I started getting into crypto. And I think at that point, they only had like a sort of market cap function for their terminal. And I was like, way too interested in this to sort of just stay here. And so I worked at a couple different startups in crypto, which was interesting. It's definitely a bit of the Wild West at that point. I think it was 2017 and 18, and then landed, as you know, at the tie for a couple of years, and we helped sort of shepherd that new brand into fruition, and which was exciting. And then yeah, joining Forge is basically the same thing as the tie, except it's not. They're not aggregating information, they're aggregating, say, trades of private shares. So, yeah,
Mhm.
it's always been sort of in the background. Design has always been in the background for me. Always been interested in it since college, so
Yeah, awesome. So let's dive into building brands, kind of your bread and butter. So I would love to hear from you your thoughts on kind of what it takes to build a brand from
sure.
scratch. You have a lot of experience doing this at multiple roles and in multiple companies. Can you touch on kind of the tactical decisions that have to go into building a brand? Not just like the more obvious things like logos and mood boards and stuff like that, but like what does a process look like from start to finish for building a brand?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So when I was first starting out, building a brand was in fact just making a logo and a collection of color palettes and just stuff. And I think that the farther along you get in your career as a designer, as an art director, as a creative director, you realize that the biggest commodity that you need to know about a brand before you start developing it is information about the brand. And so from my standpoint, starting probably more at the tie and then moving into Forge, the biggest critical point was having those strategy sessions at the outset, learning about the brand, learning the insights that separate the brand from its competitor set and what makes it a unique, sort of compelling thing. I would definitely put that as the first and foremost, getting that groundwork laid down so that when you start to draw insights from those interviews with the ELT and employees and the customers, you're not sort of just designing in a silo, as they call it. Like you have information informing the decisions you're making from a graphic standpoint. You're sort of like synthesizing that information and putting it into something visual. And so that's what we did with the tie. And then, in Forge, that's what we were starting to do right up until we were acquired by Charles Schwab. But in both cases, I was involved in the strategy sessions with a brand strategist, the interviews, reviewing the interviews, reviewing those, like, polishing those, unpolishing those nuggets of information and insights that are like, oh wow, that's such a great idea, and then building out that sort of comprehensive outlook on where the brand is going to go, which is basically a whole bunch of, like, words for, like, what's the starting point for developing the brand. That's always been, that's, I think, where as a designer I've sort of come around to and started to understand that information is way more important than, like, visual inspiration. Like, you look on Pinterest, you get an idea, you're like, whoa,
Mhm.
that's sick. And then you just kind of like shoehorn it into a design, and it might work sometimes. For me, it's been about like 50-50. You take a cool design, you're like, oh, that's cool. And, see how that works. And it works. And it's an interesting juxtaposition of, like, this sort of design idea or a motif into, like, a new brand. And then sometimes it's just like, yeah, this looks like a hack job. And so information helps customize and really bring the design into a more unique, ownable level. And that's what we just try to do as designers and creatives.
Yeah. And for the audience, Jordan and I worked together at the tie, so I was fully involved in that process of our rebrand. And exactly what Jordan's saying, we did that whole discovery process where we sat down and we did a ton of interviews with key decision makers and really helped gather that information to make informed decisions on the actual brand moving forward. So that is that is definitely the process. And in my role at Flowdesk, I actually took a lot of those learnings from that process and put them to work as we also recently went through a whole repositioning and rebrand as well, which is quite interesting. And those learnings have carried forward. So quite an interesting process there.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. It's always a road to discovery, and then all of a sudden something just kind of pops up, and then we just get going.
Yeah. So at what point do you know that we have something?
Sure.
What's
Yeah.
kind of that, yeah, what's kind of that signal that, like, okay, we're rolling, this is working, like we can start actually make developing specific assets and stuff like that.
Sure. So I think there's probably two tiers, right? As you're designing, you're taking a brand through, like, a redesign, and you're building it out, and you're obviously, like, contextualizing it as you're designing it, meaning, like, you're building out the brand and the identity system, and you're making sure that it's got a ownable track. It separates itself from the competitor set, and also draws on the learning. So it's this sort of coalesce point between all these different, like, entry and information points. And I think from, like, the when the brand is working, so to speak, I mean, I think you can determine that from, like, the hard nuts and bolts of, like, say, a KPI system, whether it's social media engagement or customer comments, or increased time spent using the product. I think those are, like, the hard and fast, like, ways to determine whether or not a brand is evolving into a better place. But I think from my standpoint, and from the better sort of ROI, so to speak, on a brand redesign, is more from, the morale it builds internally with a company. I think that when we showcased the Thai rebrand, like, it was an all hands meeting, and we were taking them through, like, the deck, and then when there was a big reveal, like, people were genuinely excited, and it was
Mhm.
like, oh, thank gosh, like, we have this thing now that we can get excited behind, and not just, like, this random legacy alien thing floating around there that's just, like, not really telling any story, that's not part of any sort of brand narrative. And so that, to me, is always the exciting part. And that's the part where I feel like, now that you've sold in, the company, the employees, the ELT is obviously behind it because they were in part of the process at the outset. I think it allows the company to operate just a lot better across, all facets. And it also allows the ELT to tell a better story. And when they're telling the story of the company and they're evoking the brand, there's a connection there. It's not just like, oh yeah, we're this brand, we're this company. Oh yeah, by the way, that logo has nothing to do with what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
And it's like, when you have that connection, and that uniformity across, like, the verbal component, the tone on the presentation, and the marketing, and how the ELT is talking about it and how employees are talking about it, whether it's online or in person. I think that's when you know that it's actually like it's working from, yeah.
Yeah, I love those sessions when you introduce this whole new concept and visuals and positioning statements and all that stuff to employees who were not involved in the process at all. And they actually have that aha moment like, oh, wow, you guys put so much work into this. This
Yeah.
is really exciting. This is something that I can go show my friends who have no idea what I do. And now I can explain it to them much more easily, like what our company does and what I do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It gets getting everybody on board and getting them excited is critical. Because if you have a collection of people that kind of working at a company and they don't really know kind of where it's going, it feels like a bit of a drift. They're going to be one foot out the door, and they're not going to really be excited about devoting time and effort to making the job better and the company better. So it's important to do those things.
Yeah. Specifically in digital assets,
Sure.
it feels like our industry moves at lightning pace, right? And
It does.
a lot of founders, they have that mentality of let's ship something and refine it later. And I feel like a lot of that is translated also into brand building as well. So a lot of times there's pressure from the ELT and founders to, do this rebrand. Let's get it done in a few weeks. When realistically it should take way more time than that. Is there any concept to like a minimal viable brand, or does cutting corners kind of cost you in the long run if that's the approach?
I mean, that's interesting because like a minimal viable brand, like what would that even look like? You have, I mean, when Google first came out, Google was effectively the brand itself was like this ridiculously simple logo and then a search field, and that was it.
Mhm.
From a branding standpoint, I mean, that was definitely the minimal viable, brand. But you brought up a good point, and it's a conventional idea that when you said that brands should take longer to be developed and not just sort of like put together. I think you mentioned that earlier in your question, and so I agree with that. I think that this like completely truncated and tighter timeline for creating a brand and just creating this whole presentation and just having it pop up out of nowhere. I feel like when you do that right out of the gate, it could feel a little bit disingenuine. It could feel artificial more times than not when brands like that sort of pop up, particularly like in Twitter, say if it's a protocol or an NFT project or something like that. It's basically a rinse and repeat of another brand. And
Mhm.
you could see almost like the structure around it, and it's a not really ownable. It feels, like I said, it feels disingenuine. It feels artificial. It doesn't feel like it's a real thing, which only exacerbates the problem of trust in the digital media space, which and I know is absolutely paramount to maintain and to create. So when you're just creating a lot of that stuff, I feel like you sort of end up to be like, think about it like you're this person at the party that's just yelling and talking a lot, but they're not really saying anything. And I mean, how would you solve for that? So let's say people are watching this and they're trying to put together a brand as soon as possible. Well, I would say hold on, take some time, figure out like what your competitor set is, and figure out do the sort of necessary brand steps to figure out like what exactly you're trying to say and how you want to present yourself, and then focus on the things closest to the product and the highest profile aspect. Don't like lacquer the internet with social media blurbs and tactics and amazingly, you know, uh, super dicey rendered videos. It's like everybody like they make a brand and then they put out that video of like the Times Square thing, where it's like a mock-up and it's like, oh my lord. Like that's not real. That was never real. And when you do stuff like that, you're just kind of, you're digging your own sort of like brand grave, so to speak. So I think moving slow and being deliberate will will get a much better ROI in the digital asset space. To just sort of be a counter to a lot of that frenzy out there, I think is probably would be a better approach. Definitely a more unique approach, that's for sure.
Yeah. Speaking of that frenzy out there, I want to double click on trust in the industry and trust as a brand that
Yeah.
you just previously mentioned, specifically in financial services and in crypto. Trust is probably the most important thing for a brand. But with that said, I think it's not that obvious to founders as that trust needs to be kind of like the first and foremost, I guess, value or goal of like a brand and what marketing builds for the brand. But what does trust actually mean as someone who builds brand? How do you construct it and what does that actually mean?
Well, I mean, depending on the industry, trust is more critical in certain ones that are more like, say, pioneering and a little bit more like volatile and Wild West, like digital assets, for instance. Like trust, as you know, is absolutely paramount. So I think when you're developing a brand in that sort of space, you've got to make sure you avoid the pitfalls of coming off, say, like too transparent. When CEOs like publish a video on Twitter and they're like, we did some stuff and we screwed up and blah blah. It's like, man,
Yeah.
I just stop. Transparency is good, but when it's leveraged on social media, it just absolutely stinks of suspect and ingenuineness. It's like it doesn't feel real. Again, like avoiding the corny mock-ups of your brand at the top of the Empire State Building. It's like, ay ay ay. You keep your copy tone calm and measured. Is that sort of what you were asking? I mean, that's how I would approach it in the digital asset space, and that's how I've always tried to sort of keep in mind, because if you spend enough time across the whole digital asset ecosystem, there's a lot of people screaming and yelling, and to be the opposite of that almost makes you stand out that much more. So, and it also does you a service to come off and appear measured and serious, and not like, willy nilly. You can't wait to rug pull like a whole collection of investors and et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah, there's almost like this vibe that you can give off that is if you're trying too hard with
yeah,
all this like glamorous social media stuff, that is like the thing you shouldn't do to build trust. If you're kind of like more like a quieter brand and more serious, that's a lot of times, especially for an institutional audience, builds trust faster than trying to kind of beat your chest and make all these proclamations before you can actually just like let your product do the work and let the product and the team build trust through the relationships that and the clients that you're building, right?
sure. And one thing, like when you're building for retail, obviously, like retail and institution is different. And institutional is different. Like when we're building for, we're publishing tactics for like the tie, like marketing campaigns and things like that. There needed to be like an air of seriousness, because it was an institutional brand, or it is an institutional brand. So the whimsicalness, maybe a little bit in the tone of the copy on occasion, but for the most part, it just needs to be serious, because you're dealing with information, and information should be objectively delivered. There should be no bias with information. I mean, that's specific to the tie. But then again, when you're dealing with like in other projects where I've developed brands for retail, whimsy is important, right? Because you don't want to come off too stodgy for, say, a collection of people that want to have some fun with a project. Uh, to that point, I would say, I mean, while transparency is good, but if it's like an NFT project, to be as simple as possible in place of being overly showy, or uh, celebritizing like the brand. Like if you're just trying to make something cool, like I was working on a project where we were having fun with Polygon and creating like this system where, like, if you bought Polygon and you got an NFT, you could actually go and like update it and update it and update it. And it was a fairly unique idea. Like it was really cool. It just, the problem was that it just sort of ran afoul of the market at the time, and that's what happens sometimes. But the thing that I thought was really cool about it was like it wasn't serious at all. It was a lot of fun, and we had a character and stuff like that. And you could basically buy this NFT and you could get your base character, and then you update it by doing certain things. And the steps to do that were very, very simple, and it was great. And we didn't need a CEO to go on and apologize to people. We didn't need to talk in like overt acronyms and, like swarm people with like a drop or something like that and like, pulverize them with like text every five. It was just like, or tweets every 5 minutes. It was just like, here's the idea, check it out, have some fun with it. Let me know what you think. We're trying to make a cool project. And that was it. And that sort of, I don't want to say like benevolence or altruism, but like the idea, like we're just trying to make something cool. What do y'all think? Carried through in the brand. And that was the idea. And I think that if you don't focus on that and you try too hard, you're gonna kneecap like a retail project that could be really cool, but you're just trying really, really too hard.
Yeah, that NFT era is kind of a really interesting case study, I think, for branding, because I would say like pretty much everyone didn't get it right because we're not really we're not really talking about NFTs as really a viable
Yeah, I probably just dated
valuable.
myself,
Yeah.
but it was a good case study in like how to develop a retail brand. And
Mhm.
some NFT products did it better than others. I mean, you had brands that like they got way ahead of themselves and started to develop a whole ecosystem around their brand that was completely unnecessary and flamed out quicker because they were like, people were like, I don't want to, this is becoming and evolving into a project that is losing, is deviating too much from the original idea, which was really cool. Sometimes an NFT project is just that. An NFT project doesn't need to be a whole ecosystem of, burger joints and coffee shops and and horrible, curated, concerts. Like it could just be an NFT project and then that's fine.
Yeah.
And that's all it needs to be. And if anything happens beyond that, rest assured it's organic. And then that's
Yeah.
what you want, You want like two idiots like me and you to go and buy an NFT and go, you know what? I want to have an NFT party at this bar in my neighborhood. Great, do it. You know, I perhaps it shouldn't be sponsored by the NFT company. It should just be completely organic. That
Mhm.
makes it more interesting to me.
Yeah. What about companies in the crypto space who kind of try to tailor to both institutional and retail audiences? I think this is more common maybe with like an L1 blockchain, like Solana, for example. They tailor to both audiences and they do a pretty good job at segmenting, their offerings for both audiences. But do you think like the it's really challenging to kind of really to try and go after both an institutional and a retail audience? Is it a mistake to do that, or is there a version that actually works, like maybe Solana, or if you take someone who's like a new competitor Solana, like the Canton network, they're they're really finding their niche in just the institutional audience, and they're taking a lot of market share from maybe what Solana's institutional audience would be. So I think there's a few ways you can approach it, but what do you think is the right way, even if there is a right way?
Sure. If you're gonna be a brand that's going to operate in two different spectrums, retail and institutional, I think what Canton did right was that they reverse engineered it. So they started working with banks right out of the gate. And that allowed them to operate sort of in the space without having to go through the front door. When it comes to something like Coinbase or Kraken, or Solana, where they have two different, I mean, their product functionally is two different tracks, right?
Mhm.
They've got institutional and then they've got retail, obviously. I think those three companies do it really well in that they keep and maintain the sort of flagship brand like Kraken. Like you'd recognize the Kraken logo anywhere, you'd recognize the Solana logo anywhere. Coinbase, the same thing. Coinbase owns this sort of, I guess, like an index blue, and there's derivatives of that when you go as a retail visitor to their site into the institutional side. I haven't been there in a while, but it, the it's a change and it's stark, but it's still part of like the overall brand. I think that's the way to handle it. So it looks like it's building trust and structure around both institutional and retail, drawing from each other because it feels like a real thing. It feels like a comprehensive thing. It doesn't feel like two disparate things that are operating independently, but are somehow sort of connected. Kraken's the same way. And Solana, again, I haven't been, on like, exploring the Solana institutional site, but I would imagine it's similar as well.
Yeah, I
Kraken does a
think.
really good job with it. Kraken and Coinbase are exemplary. Like they've managed to create a brand that was retail focused at the outset, and then they added in these institutional sort of channels, and they did it in a way that's like, if I'm an institutional if I'm an institution and I want to say, operate with Kraken and, obviously, give them more significant business, way more significant business than say a retail customer. I feel good because I know that, this is Kraken. They've got a retail arm, they've got an institutional arm. They are working together. They are one whole unit, and that gives me confidence to work with them.
Yeah. I think a really interesting point is maybe it feels like maybe there's like a more of a systematic issue. I don't want to say issue, but just like systematic challenge of how the crypto industry has evolved, where like specifically for a blockchain or a protocol, you have like the brand for the brand that's created for a protocol, but then you have a separate brand that's created for the
Yeah.
foundation
Or the
team.
person or the
And then yeah,
founder.
then you have a separate brand that's created for like the tech team who's maybe like the labs team that's like working on the development of the protocol, and all of these separate brands are essentially working towards the same goal, but they're coexisting brands that it's confusing, right? I think so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Happy to speak to this because I've seen this happen, throughout my experience in the industry. And I feel like it's a double-edged sword, right? Because the founder of Kraken is a compelling figure. And I feel like he always comes out on the right side of a lot of these arguments and these policy issues that always come up with the government and the regulation and regulatory sort of landscape and all that stuff. And I feel like he's a bit of a champion and he's revered, like I felt like after some issues he had with the government, I was like, oh, I would love to open up a Kraken account just to support him. And the complete opposite situation happened with like Masari, where you had the founder come out and basically like implode. And then you just saw this sad, like deterioration of the company because of the owner. And, then so that's like an example where aligning too close to the founder could burn you and damage the company. And so, in my opinion, I feel like there needs to be a hard separation between the two, whether it's social media, whether it's, public discussions, events, PR, any of that kind of stuff. Because when you're dealing with a company that's responsible for people's livelihoods, it's not fair to send somebody out there as a representation, as a larger than life representation of the company without, I mean, at the very least, any sort of PR schooling and education. Like they have to understand that, while they might have founded the company is now responsible for the income of a lot of people or, somebody else besides them. And so it's respectful to have that person understand that, they can't just go out and have these, digital first implosions
Mhm.
and completely melt down and, and then basically drag the name of the company through the mud. Like I mean, the Masari thing was brutal. I
Yeah.
mean, that was brutal in real time. And I just feel bad for all the people that worked there that had no like alignment to anything that was going on. And they're just like, great. Like now if I put the word Masari on my CV, people are gonna be like, yeah, next. And, you know, that's the impression that I got.
Yeah. And you're specifically talking about the pros and cons, I guess, of founders having a really public
Yeah.
personal brand as it compares to the company brand. I
Like
think the
Brian
founder
Armstrong, I
has
would love like Brian Armstrong is he's obviously like he's been educated on how to go out and to to talk about his company or Coinbase to the public.
right. Yeah.
And he does a brilliant job and he's great.
Yeah.
And that's that's the way you do it. And like you don't ever hear mumblings of from him on digital or social media about like anything like untoward towards like, you know, he might like have he might say something like a little bit left of center or right of center, but like for the most part, it's, he knows that he's responsible for a large public company and, you have to take that into account when you're in the public.
Yeah. And he's become like a face of our industry.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So a few quick hitters to close us up here.
Which hits. Okay.
Quick hits. If you could like answer these in like less like one sentence or less.
Okay. I'll try.
If
I talk.
what do you think? I mean, you kind of really touched on some of this stuff more in more depth, but what do you think brands get wrong, or like what's a mistake that keeps playing out that you would like say brands keep doing over and over and over?
I would say don't be so noisy. I think it's okay to be a little bit demure and let the product or the other enthusiasts for the product speak on
Hmm.
your behalf.
Yeah. And what would you say is like the opposite? What do you think like some of the most credible brands are doing really well right now that like other brands should learn from?
You know what? I would say this, and this is going to be a quick hit, would be focus on security. Focus
Mhm,
on keeping your name out of anything that has to do with the word grift or leak or hack. I think that is absolutely critical. You don't go on a website like, I said that wrong, but like anytime I go on a website, like say like a crypto website, it's like one like hack issue after another.
mhm.
Your name, keep your brand's name out of that conversation. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
security is first and foremost because that speaks to also like trust. So
yeah. Back to the trust point, I mean, I have to bring this up because you
yeah,
mentioned it. We've seen like an alarming amount of DeFi hacks so far this year. Is like, how do you build a DeFi protocol when it seems like there's this systematic trust issue where maybe the native DeFi folks are okay with it and we're trying to build solutions, but new folks to the industry, they don't want anything to do with crypto in general and DeFi more specifically because they just see the headlines of
absolutely.
another protocol getting hacked.
Yeah. I mean, how would you deal with that? I would say the same thing. I mean, at this point, marketing should almost always include some aspect of security if you're going to be a DeFi product.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And it should be one of the top two. I want to know that if I transfer money from my Colder hot wallet to your app, that it's safe. I don't care how much APY that I get. I don't care what kind of like swaps I could do. I want to make sure that it's going to be if it's in there, it's not going to be taken from somebody else. I'm like a malicious actor. I mean, that's always been like the driving idea behind any DeFi activity that I've done. And I mean, I was like, there's a couple of months where like I went off on Solana, and because it's got such a rich DeFi landscape, and I went in there and I was like just trying stuff out. And it was like, like clockwork. Every like a month, like another account that I had like went down and or like was vacated. And I was like, all right, so much for that. And it wasn't like I was just trying stuff out because I wanted to experience what DeFi products were out there. And it was some were great and too many were getting hacked. And I feel like now at this point, to sort of like dovetail with the idea of trust. I mean, if you position your product as secure, and you can get into the weeds with it a little bit because I think people like to see specifics when it comes to that. I think that that'll serve you well, especially in
Yeah.
this space. And yeah, and especially with like the recent, you know, spate of news coming out about it's one after the other. It's brutal, brutal,
Mhm.
brutal.
I want to circle back really, really quickly
Yeah,
on just the Forge Charles Schwab acquisition. When it comes to like a brand perspective, how do you go about like merging the two brands? Do you do like a logo lockup where it's like Forge by Charles Schwab sort of thing, or
sure.
what are those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, so well, the interesting part was that we actually started developing a new brand, and we presented them like a whole new like identity system and logo type. I mean, it was rough,
Oh
but it
wow.
was where we wanted to go because we were developing a new brand for them, and they were like, "Cool, yeah." Anyway, because like from their standpoint, it doesn't make sense to go through a rebrand when probably what's going to happen in the next 3 years is the Forge is going to sort of be integrated to the point where it
Mhm.
might become a Charles Schwab product, and so that was a wrinkle right out of the gate. That said, incorporating the Forge logo type, the current one, into the Charles Schwab ecosystem, it's a matter of like really finding out or discovery on how they want to present it because it's going to be their ecosystem. Obviously, with our input, because I'm the brand sort of shepherd, so I'm going to have my feedback and input and suggestion and direction. But it becomes like we just do a study on the relationship is the biggest thing on where on how we were talking prominence between like the Forge logo and then brought to you by Charles Schwab. Like
Mhm.
how loud is that, or how dynamic is that, or how dramatic is that? You want to is it equal, or is it Forge by Charles Schwab, or is it Forge by Charles Schwab? You start to try to zero on what would cause the least amount of friction from a customer when they see that. That's you're always thinking about the customer's experience and try not to confuse them when they see this new shiny new thing in the Charles Schwab ecosystem. Like, what is this? Where's it from? There's value in them seeing the Charles Schwab logo attached to it, but there needs to be some finesse when it comes to creating that relationship, that visual relationship, because if it's too much, it feels like it might be like, here's this Forge thing that's kind of stitched to Charles Schwab's website. That's weird. Or here's this like Charles Schwab product that's now that was made by Forge. Like, what's that relationship like? Is this any different than anything else that Charles Schwab created? And we want to say it is. So, it's that
Mhm.
relationship that you try to manage.
Yeah.
And I mean, from a tactical standpoint, you just do a collection of, you do a study, you create a deck, and then you just, start putting together like, the logo type, X, and then Forge, or, the logo type and then presented by, and you try to find the right language, and then everybody sort of sits around and talks about it. And then somebody, up there makes a decision. And then we move forward with developing all the different assets. And then we start to sort of fold it out in the public, and where folks might see it, to maintain that thread um, of the user's thread of branding. So they're seeing Charles Schwab at every sort of touch point.
Very cool. Very interesting. One more question, Jordan, to wrap things up here.
Yep.
If someone came to you as they're kind of trying to develop and build their first brand in the digital asset space, what would you tell them is like critical? And maybe like what's something that when you were starting out, you wish someone had told you?
Yeah, good question. I would say, given like the marketing landscape for crypto and how like frenzy it feels, and how much it feels just like a deluge of just stuff and noise, to just focus on your product when you're doing marketing for the product. I don't want to say demure, but just be calm, focused on what the product does in simple language. There's a whole adage of like, Apple nailed it with like the iPod, like 1,000 songs in your pocket. Like,
Mhm.
if you could, that's incredible copywriting, but like if you could do something like that so it stands out, and it's measured, and it's serious, and there's not a lot of like gnarly mock-up nonsense, full caps, acronym, blah blah blah, obvious AI slop associated with like your brand. I would just avoid all of that. And interestingly enough, I think that alone would separate you from everybody. So it almost becomes that like addition by subtraction thing. And also, it doesn't take a lot of effort to not make slop. I feel like most brands in the crypto space just focus on slop. And there's probably like a ton of you know, six fingers, four ears, three eyes, audience members, if you just pause and look at them. So let's just avoid all that and just be serious about it. And if your product is good, it'll start to take on a life of its own. People will start to use it, they'll comment on it, they'll enjoy it, they'll, use it for whatever. And then as you're starting to get insights from the people using it, then you could start developing more targeted campaigns and things like that. I mean, it's obviously easier said than done. You've got to build a product, and I mean, I don't want to say go viral, but it's got to work, and people got to like it. But if you do that, I think a lot of the marketing will write itself. But I mean, definitely less is more in this space, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Great answer. You
Yeah.
heard it here first. If you're building a brand in crypto, Jordan's your guy. Um,
Thanks, Hop.
awesome. Well, this has been so much fun, Jordan. Really appreciate you joining the show.
Sure. Yeah. Anytime. And it's been great speaking with you. And I'm happy you're kicking it off. And I think you're doing a service for the industry. I think people out there need to know how to market in digital asset world. I think it's still the Wild West, and I think somebody like you to come out here and kind of give some structure and some expertise around it at this point, I would say is great.
I appreciate that, sir.
No sweat.
Awesome.
Anytime.
Cool. All right. We'll see you
All right, man.
guys later. Bye.